Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for another edition of Techno Brew. And today we are talking with Sydney Elaine Butler, founder of Accessible Creates. And our topic is designing workplaces for every mind and body. Sydney, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate that. I've been wanting to talk
Thank
to
you
you
so
about this for
yeah.
some time.
Yeah, it feels like we've been talking since like the start of the year almost, approximately talking about it.
I
Or
think it
like trying
was
to
like
kind of meet.
December-ish.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
trying to like find some time in between the new year and then to do this and
that's
it just
right. Yeah, yeah.
feels
It
like it's
was
been a long
late.
time coming.
It was late in 2024, like November, December, and my timing was terrible because you were busy, and then we finally got to connect in the new year, and I'm glad that we did. Yeah, and actually, we should probably thank Ryan, our friend Ryan Moore,
Yes.
for introducing us. So that's great. Thank
Shout
you,
out to
Ryan.
Ryan.
That's right. Yeah, and I know this is such an important and vital conversation for you. It's very
Mhm,
near and dear, and it's something that you do every day. So
mhm.
maybe we could start with like what inspired you to launch Accessible Creates.
That every time I think I've been asked that question before,
Yeah.
and there's so many different things that inspire me to start accessible crates, and it actually goes back to my childhood. And so I had to go to speech therapy as a child, walked on my tippy toes, and had to go to physical therapy as well. I had people in my class that needed more support than I did, and I felt like and at that point, I was always more vocal about my needs and being supportive of others. So I was like, when they didn't see that they were being supportive or treated fairly in the classroom, I would stand up for them. But then when I was being treated poorly, I kind of would shy away from that. I was like, I don't deserve that support, but I would stand up for other people. And so that was interesting. And then I studied human resources in post secondary. So I went to Sheridan College for both my advanced diploma and my degree. And I was in my employment law class in my third year of my advanced diploma, and people that already were working in human resources and people that were about to enter the HR field, we were talking about accommodations. And a lot of my classmates were like, wait, people with disabilities actually want into the workplace. Why do they get accommodations? Isn't that special treatment? All these different things.
Right.
While I was also becoming more aware of my own lived experience with disability, my relation to disability, and what that looked like to me.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm sitting right here. And
Right.
at that point, and at the same time, I was also having kids, teens, and adults with disabilities, again, advocating on their behalf, speaking up for them, and what they would say to me, using that to amplify their voice and, really do that. And then I realized that I had to really self advocate for myself to really drive this work forward and to really have more of an impact because I was really feeling burnt out. I didn't have the language at the time that was burnt out, but feeling the symptoms of burnout and all these different things already before even really traditionally starting my career. And so it got me thinking that I wish the HR world and businesses in general could be more accessible and inclusive to people like me and other people. And so that kind of inspired me to start Accessible Creates. And I also worked, before I started Accessible Creates, I worked at a startup and was transparent to the startup because I work really closely with the CEO that I'm passionate about accessibility as well. He's like, yeah, we'll get to that. It's awesome that you're passionate about that. And he kind of kept changing his mind about what he wants to do at that startup. And I was like, why am I focusing on someone else's dream and not, and then really took that step back to realize what is my dream? What do I want to do? What work do I really want to do? What work am I passionate about? What work will leave me feeling like I'm having an impact in both my communities of the disabled community and the HR community.
Yeah. And it's such vital work. I mean, I remember seeing some statistics. I was doing some research prior to my conversation with a mutual, I guess, colleague of ours, Myra Azarins, who's getting her PhD uh, this month, and just finding out that there are, I guess, autistic individuals in particular have alarmingly high rates of unemployment, and I think. Like 80% in 2023 in Canada, and
Yeah.
similar trends in the US with autistic adults
Mm-hmm.
going without pay. And it's not just an issue of
Mm-hmm.
unemployment, but also underemployment. So many autistic people
Yes.
with advanced degrees, and they end up in entry level roles. So um, I guess that's hopefully something that your work will help to answer.
I'm trying to unplug it, and it's really having people recognize that. And a lot of people talk about, like you said, like the unemployment and not being employed, but the underemployment. What does that look like, and how is it actually impacting people? What are the systems in place that are causing these things to happen? What are things that you can do is, again, human resources or businesses as a whole to shift that? And why is there a perception of that, that these people can't be able to do jobs, like you said, in entry level positions, but not in higher
Yeah,
positions. And this is such a huge issue. And so I'm really trying to address that through my work and through providing resources and really having these conversations such as we're having today.
yeah, yeah. And ironically too, like I think there's some awareness of the wonderful benefits of having a diverse work force. I was talking to a senior IT leader recently who said that in his realm, where he focuses on cybersecurity in particular, um, neurotypicals like myself, we see things very linearly and very like it's process oriented. Developers, it's very like zeros and ones and very line by line focused, and so there's a strict methodology. And when it comes to these new threat vectors like polymorphic AI threats,
Mm-hmm.
people who are on the autism spectrum have this wonderful way of seeing things and seeing the world and data, and to them it's completely normal, and for us it's very difficult, and they can see around and solutions, and they have this wonderful creativity that we just simply don't possess as neurotypicals. And when I ask, well, that's awesome, like, so how are you attracting them? He says, well, right now they don't have that in place HR wise, and so unfortunately it's hard to attract that talent. And so hopefully you and I can uncover some things that will help to address these issues across the board, because there's I think some maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel, where there's this awareness that, yeah, there's these wonderful skill sets and competencies that are there, that are just being sort of like shuffled into maybe entry level positions, where maybe I mean, if given an opportunity, they would really shine and show um, you know that the intrinsic value, and just just their
Mm-hmm.
individuality as a strength for the organization.
Yeah, and I think really understanding that, again, we all have, a lot of times my clients are like, "But what are the benefits?" There's so many articles about how neurodiversity, um, when the competitive advantage it has. But again, everyone should be considered as an individual, right? And I think, yes, by having these like these categories and having it displayed, like, oh, increases innovation, like you said, sees things in a different way, but also still understanding that we're all individuals and that we all have individual skills and things that we bring to the team, the experiences we have that shape who we are, that allow us to, we all have strengths and weaknesses at the end of the day. And so really being able to pull from those experiences and pull from those strengths is so crucial.
Yeah, yeah, and I think of like that reminds me of like the definition of like neurodiversity that I particularly like, is that this idea that
Mhm.
there are these different ways that people think, behave, interpret information, process information, and that variety in the way that people think and behave is to be celebrated.
Hmm. For sure.
So, tell me then. I mean, what I
Yeah.
guess you know. Maybe you could walk us through what accessible workplaces look like in practice, like in good practice
Hmm.
for you.
For me, I think at kind of at the core of workplace accessibility and accessible workplaces really looks at, what are the systems in the workplace, and really looking at, is the system working for everyone, right? And I think a lot of times people have the misconception that if it's working for the majority, it's working for everyone. But instead, seeing who it's not working for, seeing where those barriers are, removing those barriers, but also understanding those barriers that exist for disabled and neurodivergent individuals, and removing those, because it's going to help end up helping the whole workplace and helping it make more inclusive and more accessible for everyone involved. Ensuring that structures and policies are in place. A lot of times policies are very vague, or they're not fully understood to be fully inclusive and accessible. And so, what does that actually look like in actuality? What systems are you setting up for your employees? Is it, are you hybrid working, on site working, remote working? What does that look like for your employees? And are you providing that accessibility in that instances? A lot of times people think that, especially in the remote work, sometimes people think that, oh, it's on the employee to make sure that they're making an inclusive and accessible work environment for themselves. But they're still working at your organization, even though they're doing it remotely. You should have the duty to be like, is your work set up to so you can succeed to the best of your ability? Having an ergonomic chair like I
Right.
have, and things like that.
Yeah.
That really, that's still on the company. And people can control the working environments more, and I can control my lighting, I control the sounds and my external environment, but it's still on the employer to really help foster that as well. And also understanding that a lot of times when companies think of an accessible workplace, they just think of a ramp, which is a crucial part of
Sure. Yeah.
accessibility and accessibility in the workplace. But it's so much more than that. It includes also the digital tools, the communication tool. Are you communicating in ways that the employee needs to be communicated to? Do you have tools for your managers or your supervisors or even fellow employees to know how to communicate in different ways? Communicate via email if that's what someone prefers. Having a phone call, having a Zoom call, or something like
Yeah.
that. How does that employee best interact and best process that information to best show up at work and best interact with their peers and supervisors?
Right. And I guess allowing them to present themselves and show up however it feels
Mm-hmm.
best for them without fear of being as one of our LinkedIn um, attendees said, neurotypical see us as quirky without the fear of being, seen as other, right? So, I mean,
Yeah, exactly. And really, that breaking down the perception and really recognizing that bias that might exist. And we all have our own internal
sure.
biases based on our own experiences which shape us. But it's really catching yourself in that bias before you perpetrate that cycle and those thoughts of what you think of when you think of disabled and neurodivergent employees and people in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess for companies that who don't have the benefit of maybe a Sydney Elaine Butler working with them, looking at maybe frameworks that are available in terms of like a universal design for workplaces, like where that it strives to create these environments and products and services that are usable by all people to the greatest extent, and designing for diversity, fostering inclusivity, and making workplaces more accessible and welcoming for all employees, regardless of age, disability, or background. And I'm reading off of that because I'm going to mess it up if I don't. But I mean, does that capture the spirit of what it is that you help your clients?
Yeah, I, yeah, I hope them really understand why it's beneficial to create more inclusive and accessible workplaces in general. Like looking at systems, looking at policies and procedures, looking at the day to day and the nitty gritty of all your employees, but then also understanding that it's not going to be a one size fits
Yeah,
all. Just gonna you still have to accommodate employees, but they need to be accommodated. There's going to have still have gaps. Still going to have issues. And so, but you have less issues if you start implementing these inclusive designs and the universal design. But again, we human beings, we have complex needs and complex things to implement
yeah,
sometimes, but they're not really that complex. Just having, checking in with someone, if you're a manager on a regular basis. Okay, what does that regular basis look like? Does it look like daily when they first join the organization, weekly once they get more comfortable, even monthly? What does that look like? And having those ongoing communications and support is so crucial in really fostering an accessible environment. And I think it starts from giving, the employees and managers and supervisors that awareness and giving them those tools and resources to really pull from
Yeah.
when it when it comes to that one-on-one support.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and that really comes through that one-on-one support. We were just talking before we started here about if you've met one autistic person, you've just met one autistic person, because no one
Exactly.
of us is alike, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I guess maybe taking a bit of a step back when you look at organizations that have DEIB policies in place, diversity,
Hmm.
equity, inclusion, belonging policies, and you've been called in to kind of to consult to help. What are some of the biggest
Yeah.
concerns for you when you review these? Like, what are some? I don't know. Would red flag be a fair term? Any red flags? Any concerns when you see them when you're reviewing?
Yeah, I think like they're just like things that are like the glaring gaps in a way. And so a lot of times, sometimes the policies haven't been updated since before the pandemic. And that's a huge red flag, so to speak,
Right.
because it's like, why hasn't it been updated during the pandemic? Because I was auditing a policy for a company and it was about their telecommunications, right? And it was kind of connected to diversity inclusion. And that only in extreme circumstances, if you have doctor's note and all these different paperwork, can you work remotely?
Right.
And I'm working with them and they're working remotely. And I'm like, you're working remotely.
Yeah.
I'm like, so is this all true? And they're like, oh no, we're gradually going back into the office now, and now it's kind of the reverse,
Right.
right? And so really looking at, okay, you know, annually looking at your policies and procedures, and that happened with a couple clients,
Right.
not with that specific type of policy,
Yeah.
but with different policies. Well, this policy hasn't been updated since prior to the pandemic, or even 5 years before the
Right.
pandemic. Why is it taking you so long to review it and audit it or look at it to modify it? And really understanding that's a huge issue. And then also looking at, are you using inclusive language in your policies? What does that look like? Do you have policies are usually like kind of like the guidelines of the goals of the company, and the procedures are like what are the actual steps you can take. And sometimes there's companies that only have the policies at the high level overview but don't break down the procedures, and that's such a huge issue because you can have all this high level but then people don't actually know how to implement it effectively. They don't know, and so it's on the individual that's reading the policy. For example, HR is reading the policy or a manager is reading the policy and trying to implement it, but they have no framework to know how to implement
Right.
it. So they're just like, this is what the policy says in their interpretation, this is how they're going to implement it. And that leads to
Mm,
inconsistency for the employees. The employees are not going to know, can I be accommodated? This one manager accommodated me. And I was talking to my friend, they didn't get accommodation from their manager. Why is that? And really, that's when the bias can really set in, and the unconscious bias. Sometimes we're understanding that, oh, we usually don't provide accommodations, or the person hasn't had experience providing accommodations for employees
right.
before. They don't know what to do. The policy is just very vague, or it's just in Ontario, the AODA, and that's basically based in the
Yeah.
legislation. And so, there's a lot of room for the interpretation, and that's where the problems really set in.
Right. Yeah. That's what tremendous challenge that you have to help companies to overcome. Um, when things are, I guess when you go in and you see these challenges and you help them to kind of work through building out frameworks and processes to 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 truly enact this DEIB policy or accessibility inclusive policies.
Mhm.
What kind of changes or results have you seen with clients, and have the clients themselves seen after working with you?
Yeah, I like, so for example, like I was mentioning how we have the AODA policy here in Ontario. And so a lot of companies I've worked with, they just had that policy. I'm like, you should have a policy directly about accommodation, because the AODA briefly touches on accommodation, but it's very, again, very high level, very
Yeah.
basic. And so instead, I'm like, I can help you come up with an accommodation policy. I can write it, but I was working with them very closely they know the company best. I'm a third party consultant coming
Right.
in, so I only know so much, I only know what they tell me. And so really looking at, okay, this is it's usually included in an accommodation policy. This is what it should have. This is to really start people can feel more comfortable asking for accommodations. The managers and human resources feel more comfortable
Right.
implementing accommodation. So really taking it from just kind of the legislation based policy and really formulating into okay, the guidelines and the goals of accommodation and actually the procedure aspect of okay, this is the accommodation process. This is, if an employee requests an accommodation, or if you think, if you're the manager again or the human resources that think an employee might need accommodation, what does that process look like? And really breaking it down into what that process actually looks like and how you can really get the ball rolling.
Right. And for those of our audience that don't know what the what AODA means or represents,
Yes.
can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's the Accessibility Ontario Disabilities Act. It was inaugurated in 2005. The work before that, I met the person, one of the people that actually worked on
Wow,
that, which I'm so cool.
very cool.
But yes, and so really looking at, and so there's like the ADA, the Americans Disability Act in the United States, and so having that legislation that's trying to really help create places that are more accessible. And so it also translate into the workplace. There's in Ontario, where I live, they have to do an AODA training, the accessibility for Ontario's Disability Act. They have to do that training to learn how to be more accessible. But again, it's very bare boned. It's very um, they're working right now on a specific employment section, and they're building up more sections of that, but you still have to implement it and have a policy in your company that's based on that legislation if you're in Ontario.
Right,
But really understanding again that that's kind of the bare minimum, and that compliance and with legislation is the bare minimum.
right, right. And I guess in terms of like, thanks for explaining that. But in terms of like the outcomes that clients have seen, and I guess where I was wondering if you have some feedback from your clients in terms of like improved retention, morale, just have you seen marked
Yeah,
improvements?
it was there was one client when we were writing the accommodation policy, and like, oh, because before they're like, well, we don't really have many accommodation requests. I'm like, that's because you don't have a policy and people don't know they can ask for accommodation
Yeah.
very nicely. And they're like, that makes sense. And then we wrote it, and they were like, and as we're writing, they're like, are you sure they're not going to take advantage of the system? Because they were worried they're going to take advantage. They're like, oh no, everyone's going to want accommodations or like all these different
Sure.
things. And it's like we'll make it very clear in the policy. We'll make it very, yeah. We do trainings to roll it out to make sure the people team know how to roll it
Yeah.
out, what their role was in it, then the managers and the all staff, and really understanding that people, when they saw how they could be accommodated, and knowing that, and then I had some people reach out to me directly. The direct employees reach out to me saying, "No, I finally felt like I could be accommodated. I feel less burnt out in the organization because I now got the support I needed."
Yeah.
Managers feel, and then managers even themselves felt like I felt like I can better support my employees, and I had more tools, resources, and had things to back them up. Because previously, the employees had asked for
Yeah.
accommodation, and the managers like, I don't know what to do, and they kind of were like, just like did what they could, but what they had,
Yeah.
but they didn't think it was sufficient enough. It was just a blanket, to cover it for now. And so by having the policy clear and having the training to also roll it out really allowed for universal comprehension of what accommodation really means in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elizabeth Wang made a comment here about three pillars, I guess, that help to make this possible: the education, the tools, and support. And I want to talk about that education aspect because you touched on that there's this perception that accommodations are something that individuals will take advantage of, and so it's a bad thing, accommodations, right? And rather than I think what universal design and what you're doing kind of the aspect is kind of like this has a benefit of being, I guess, a positive framework that results in positive outcomes for everyone across the organization. And the reason why this comes really to mind is when I was talking to my Ezrans, she did a study of 200
Mhm.
individuals, 100 individuals that are on the autism spectrum and 100 neurotypicals. And it was all about, interview. In this case, it was about interviews, interview processes, and practices, and you know what were the fears and anxieties, and what were the challenges with the way things were, and then what accommodations, quote unquote, would you want. And when they looked at the results, they saw that for the large part, like almost across the board,
Mhm.
neurotypicals and neurodiverse, in this case autism, people identified with autism,
Mhm.
they all wanted the same things, the same accommodations, that getting maybe having that ability to have a video component where you could record as many times as you want, because it could be an anxiety provoking to speak to a person and be on the spot and be super nervous. Having the questions in advance, even if it's like a few hours in advance or a day in advance, so that you could properly formulate responses and give like the answer that you would give if you're actually working in the job, and we're assigned a task. You're not going to wing things. You're going to do your research, and you're going to do the best you can for the most part, right? I mean, so kind of and it sounds like that's part of your role too, like helping people understand. No, it's not about an accommodation to help people like get away with
Yeah.
bloody
Even like
murder,
how,
right?
yeah, like you were mentioning, yeah, like you were mentioning the article. Like you sent me that
Yeah,
article, and I read it. I highlighted key points so that I can help my clients more. Like I have to continue my education and learning more, and I don't know everything, and I people say, oh, you're a subject matter expert. I'm the subject matter expert because I keep continuously learning new things and learning how to better communicate that to my clients and learning for myself what that actually looks like. And so taking that moment to educate myself and be reading articles, I set aside, I have once a month, I just read articles and read all these different things to be sure I'm current and relevant and still, am up to date with my knowledge because things change so
yeah,
fast. New research is coming out every day, which is amazing. And so then being able to, and then I sometimes even cite these articles, or when I have, that, oh, that's a really good point, and I cite it in my trainings, or I cite it and explain to my client, because I'm like, I didn't come up with this content. I can talk, I can speak to it and give it more depth and give it in the context that my clients will
yeah,
understand. But I didn't come up, I didn't do that research, and so giving credit where credit's due, and really continuing education. And we know education is so
sure,
powerful, right? And education and learning, being open to learning. And I think also with education, when you have training individuals, when training my clients or working with my clients, sometimes the greatest learning and education is that unlearning and
yeah,
unlearning those behaviors and biases,
yeah,
or even unlearning how to, because I think sometimes, we think, oh, our biases are there to protect us, that sometimes we taught
right,
that, but it's like, okay, why do I have this bias? Why do I have this perception? And unlearning those behaviors and unlearning these biases,
yeah.
and really moving forward and catching yourself and being able to educate yourself and to be educated on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam kind of talks to that in a way. They're talking about, how I guess tolerance and understanding come from a place of conflict, because you're in conflict with your own biases, with your social norms, and
Mhm.
then the more questions you ask, instead of jumping to conclusions, you're opening yourself up to a new way of thinking, and new understandings. So I think that's a very valid point. Um, well, and I guess as we talk about this as well, I mean, there are some. You had mentioned burnout, right? And I felt like this is something that probably like maybe we could talk about, because it's a real thing. And um and maybe we could talk on, like maybe we could touch on, like, why the burnout, like, and so we could talk about maybe some masking, like what masking is, and the
Mhm.
fears and anxieties that people on the autism spectrum um, experience. It's a very real and can be very debilitating thing.
Yeah, like I remember, so I, when before the pandemic, I was going to school full time, I was working, basically full time hours too. I was doing a lot. I was never home. I was volunteering with Girl Guides of Canada. I was never home, and then we were kind of forced to stay home during the beginning of the pandemic, and I and then so I because I still had to go to school because they switched to online school, but then that finished for the year in April, and then after that I was applying for an internship, but I was still like, but I was like maybe I could take this time to take care of myself or like just relax a little bit, but also looking for an internship. And then I was sleeping a lot and all these different things and realizing that, oh, I think I was masking for like the past like 5 years, but didn't realize,
Right.
since going into post-secondary and realizing that toll it's had on me, right? And recognizing that, because in high school I knew I was masking and I knew that my masking in high school led to depression and other things. And I felt like I was a chameleon because I felt like I was so many different people. Because I would just whoever I was with, I'd be like, okay, I would act like them, and so really to protect myself and not be seen, not you know be seen as a certain way, and so really recognizing that that leads to a lot of health problems, including mental health challenges,
Yeah.
and so really recognizing that why do I feel the need to mask? How am I masking? How
Right.
oh what it means when I'm not masking? Who am I when I'm not masking? Who am I when I am masking and really recognizing that in myself. And I'm still learning what that looks like for
Right.
me, right? And so really recognizing that sometimes you do it for so long you don't even realize that you're doing it until you stop, and then it kind of catches up with you. Or sometimes it's an active, like you're masking, and you're like, like, no, I have to mask in this certain situation,
Right.
and even that mental toll, preparing yourself now. So for me, I try not to mask as much as
Right.
possible, but sometimes it's kind of innate, or you
Sure.
still do it because you don't want different, in different aspects of your life. And so sometimes I'm like, I have to mask, like it's like gets the physical. So then sometimes having strategy and things in place. Okay, I'm gonna have to mask at this event. I reward myself with Netflix after. You know what I mean? These
Right.
little simple
Sure.
things um, to really help myself. Like sometimes I need to watch Netflix before I go to an event, or sometimes I do it after. What does that look like? And seeing, really checking with myself. Okay, a couple of days. Oh, I felt better after I watched Netflix after the event, and I felt like I could decompress and take the mask
Right.
off. Or if some days, oh, that was a huge thing. I felt like I had to have a little me time, have a little unmask time, and then mask, right? And so being able to recognize it within yourself. And then I think creating spaces where you allow people to be themselves. And when you see someone doing something that you want to do, like example, stimming, like I'm fidgeting with my fidget toy right
Right.
now, and like that's, huh? What are you doing? Like, because that's not what they're used to. I haven't seen that behavior
Yeah.
before. And instead of being judgmental, being just generally inquisitive, people could tell the difference, or be like, or even say, because sometimes it's hard. You don't know the person, and
Yeah.
sometimes tone's a hard thing. Sometimes, especially if I'm tired and other factors, and so just say, hey, I've never seen this before. Can you explain to me what you're doing? And and I'm just
Right.
curious,
Right.
and I'm really prefacing that I'm not judging you. I'm just curious. I've never seen this before. Can you explain that to me a bit
Yeah.
more? And so really having strategies for both yourself and also creating spaces where people feel like they can be themselves, and that
Yeah.
if people do have questions and have bias, that they can ask in a way that is gentle and kind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would go um, like it's such a long way to avoid you from having to hide your traits just to appear neurotypical for the rest of the world. 'Cause that would
Mm-hmm.
be such an immense burden, right?
I have a story. It's not about in the workplace, but I think it's still kind of relevant because so just how there's different generations in the workplace, and so I took my partner to my grandfather's house, my papa's house, and so usually my partner likes being on his phone because that's how he fidgets. He likes watching just like the YouTube shorts, and because otherwise he'll pick at his skin, right? But I'm like, he's like, oh, I can't be on the phone because I don't want to seem rude to your
Yeah.
grandfather because that, And so I brought a fidget toy. I brought a fidget spinner for him, and he was just playing with a fidget spinner. And my papa hadn't seen that before. The fidget toy. I've seen my partner do it before, and he's like, "Oh, what's that?" And he's like, "Oh, it just I just like to play with it." And he's like, "Oh, it's like it's like a Rubik's cube," and having that relation and be like, "Oh, okay, that's
Right.
cool." And then he's fidgeting about talking to my grandfather, and so also in the workplaces, sometimes because Gen Z and younger generations are now into the workplace are now being more comfortable with fidgeting or when the time and place to fidget. And so instead of being like, oh, what, all these, they're just fidgeting with the things, and instead of being like, oh, what you doing over there? Oh, that's kind of cool, and relating back to something they
Yeah.
know, right? And so really, again, coming from a place of curiosity and just general, and asking in a kind manner.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. And I just noticed there's a comment here that kind of I guess went back to our it's from Elizabeth again. How I guess going back to when we were talking about the framework before, we were talking about the I guess the improvements in overall like just well being and not less like necessary sorry less feeling like masking and would be necessary in your workplace where you could be kind of yourself. But just to say that you know senior management support key to DI wins, but the continuous process and not a one-time looking good trophy. I think that's definitely true. When you see industries like because you're working across a number of
Mhm.
different organizations across the industry, do you see like are there any particular like industries where companies are kind of like really making good progress, kind of maybe a bit of where you're seeing the most momentum for inclusion, or specific types of companies where you're seeing that?
Yeah, so I feel like it's interesting because I feel like startups want to do more of this work, but they don't have quite the capital yet.
Right.
But they're like, we need to. So, but they're trying to embed it from the very beginning. They're writing the policies. They're having this in
Yeah.
mind, right? They're trying to do things that are cost effective to actually implement this and kind of create it in the process and how they do things at work, even like when they do interviews and stuff like that, and taking all the inclusive things and trying to implement that into their companies. And then I think bigger companies, to Elizabeth's point, sometimes they're just looking for that good trophy, that one-off trophy,
Right.
um, and that they have lots of capital to play with and to actually fully invest. But they're like, oh well, our employees haven't complained, or like it's not broken. If it's not broken, don't fix it, kind of
Sure.
thing. But it's like really still evaluating that. Some bigger companies are looking at it, um, but still not to the full extent that they should. And then I find most of my clients are like small to medium sized
Sure.
organizations, because across different industries, because a lot of times they're not quite in the startup stage, but they know they want to grow, right? They want to get to be a bigger company. They want to develop their people, develop that
Yeah.
capital. And so they're like taking that step back to be like, okay, what's going well with the company? What are people liking about working here? What do they have to say? And really taking into account what their employees are saying or not saying, right? And trying to find different ways of engaging inclusivity and having these conversations, and really looking at how can they make their company more inclusive and accessible.
Yeah, I think that's immensely hopeful and wonderful to hear. Not just from the startup, because to me that makes a lot of sense, and I love that. And it doesn't surprise me at all. It's a clean slate. Like we're building this. We want a great culture. Let's start from the get go. Let's get DIB in there. Let's make sure that we are creating this
Mm-hmm.
accessible workplace for all types of individuals. I think that's wonderful. But also to hear that companies in the mid market, the SMB space, also thinking about that because they see like this like not only just I guess a competitive advantage in terms of feeling like it's a pathway to growth in a really positive way and creating a good culture, but also that it's what the people in their organization are wanting as well, and they're kind of listening. And it's easier to enact because they're smaller than an enterprise where you've got 5,000, 10,000 people and multiple lines of business where like maybe it's a bit nightmarish to get a policy in place. Maybe it seems like a harder obstacle, and maybe it seems more doable when you're a mid market or SMB kind of a business.
Mhm.
So I think that's really cool. Um, and I guess to that point, then, like, what are small, because we're talking about, like, that this isn't we're not talking about, like,
Yeah.
we're talking about perhaps a molehill, or maybe it's a mountain. I don't know. You could probably
Mhm.
describe this best. But what small but impactful changes can organizations make right now to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I think really it's so simple but so effective. But really listening to your employees, I think really listening to what they have to say, and this can be in both like formal settings, so like having a survey, having town halls. What does that look like? But also allowing for those spaces where people just having a conversation, with checking, because we have performance management, but also being like, hey, the manager's asking, how do you think that conversation went? How did you feel about it? Did you feel it was constructive? Could you think I could have done better? And just really having those ongoing conversations with your employees and actually listening, and not taking it. I think sometimes like human resources and managers sometimes take it as a personal attack. With like they're like, oh, this could have been better, or like, right? But really understanding it's not a personal attack. It's just how can we overall improve the workplace and improve the way of working in this
Yeah,
organization. And so also looking at your core values. Does a core value still align with what we're doing? Are we matching up to our core values? If you say you value diversity or you value inclusion, are you actually holding up to that? What are things you're doing every day to actually look at that and to really implement that to the best of your ability? What does your company culture look like? And that could be a big thing, but it's also again that day to day and the aspect. How do your employees talk to each other, interact with each other, and what does that really mean? And really understanding that again, like I keep saying, but really addressing your unconscious biases because again, we all have unconscious
sure.
biases that shape how we view the world and how we view our place in the world. But really understanding again how my bias is getting in the way. Is it trickling to the company culture? Is it impacting the overall company culture? Is my internal bias, my unconscious bias, someone else's unconscious bias to the organization? Why do we have this collective unconscious bias towards neurodivergent and disabled folks? Do we even when providing accommodations,
Hmm.
understanding sometimes people are like, oh, or people are like, why did they get accommodate? Why did they get the ergonomic chair? Why did they get this?
Yeah,
Right? And so,
yeah.
it happens,
Ergonomic
right? And
chairs for
so,
everyone. Right?
but it's like,
Yeah,
okay, this is, not having to say exactly why they're getting the ergonomic chair, but, having awareness training or bring awareness that accommodations are there for a
yeah,
reason in these certain instances, right? And really, again, the managers or the HR that's rolling out and implementing these accommodations, of an autistic employee asks for an
yeah,
accommodation and another autistic employee asks for accommodation, and it's two different
yeah.
things. Sometimes managers are like, wait, it can't be, it's not the same thing. Again, with two different individuals, it's going to be two different accommodations that we need. It can also depend on the day what we need.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love this conversation, and the reason why it is I love talking with you. We always have these great conversations. I love your insights, and the piece that was missing in my conversation with Myra before was we were talking about the interview process, right? And simple, perhaps easy accommodations that can be made that are beneficial to everyone, like, flexibility in interview times, assistance with logistics and maybe getting to interviews, or allowing for video interviews or even recording interviews, and unlimited recording sessions. Um, receiving interview questions ahead of time. These kind of, thoughtful, I guess, um, allowances that allow for, mindful and relevant responses, and that would align maybe with the work habits that are desired for that particular role and in the workplace. But that just addressed kind of like the pre-hiring, and then what she had said was, many companies want, they might have a great, like, accessible, interview process, but then they drop the ball once onboarding happens.
Yeah.
Okay, great. You feel good, and then now you're contending with a neurotypical workplace, and so the fact
Yeah.
that you and I are having this conversation is wonderful because it then provides that other aspect, the other part of the spectrum, no pun intended, where we are talking about what else companies can do than to keep building on what they might have already started in their pre-hiring processes. So
Yeah, when I first started my business, I was like, I'm just gonna like a lot of companies wanted to just focus on the
yeah,
hiring, and so I was helping them with hiring, so meeting the people where they're
yeah,
at, and there's so many other companies that also help with hiring, and there's a lot of companies that to retain. There's not a lot of talk about the retention
sure,
piece, right? And so I was like, policies and procedures. I'm a huge policy procedures and legislation
yeah,
nerd, and so it just made sense. And really looking at it, again, that's the backbone of an organization. And so really looking at, okay, what's in these policies that are preventing the actual retention? Because there's recruitment policies too in the companies. And there's with the retention piece, and it's like recruitment and the employee life cycle. That's the whole, like, from the recruitment process all the way to when the employee leaves the organization. Even after they're gone, it's still going to have the impact of how it happened to the organization. And because a lot of times, especially for neurodivergent and disabled folks, you know, a lot of times, the employee life cycle ends, you terminate the employment, but sometimes the negative and the positive stay with people, stay long after they're gone, neurodivergent, disabled or
yeah,
not, right? If you had a positive work environment that, you felt like you could thrive, you could get the support you needed, you could do your work to the best of your ability, you're going to remember
yeah,
that. Right, but on the flip side, even more so, sometimes you're going to remember the negative. You're going to remember, I didn't feel like I was supported. I didn't feel like I got the accommodation I deserved. My manager didn't know how to accommodate me
yeah,
properly, right? And so that sense of anxiety and trauma when you're going to applying for the next job, and that's going to really skew how you go about looking for jobs in the future.
yeah. Speaking of the future, then I just want to be mindful of the fact that we've got, about 13 minutes left here, and maybe I'll ask one last, like, interview question
Mm-hmm.
here, where like, what, I guess, you mentioned early on about you learning to advocate for yourself. So, there's a responsibility, I suppose, on the leadership and the organization to create this framework and policy that is beneficial to everyone. But then, what can individuals that identify on the spectrum, how can they, I guess, how do you help um, neurodivergent employees advocate for themselves? I mean, some organizations are really good at having ERG groups, employee resource groups, where there's a disability group, or there's um, uh, uh, a neurodiversity group, or an LGBTQ group, right? So, and those are ways of them kind of like I guess, getting together and kind of like advocating as a group. So how can, I guess, organizations help to create I guess, an environment where they can do that, and what can employees themselves do to advocate for themselves? Or what suggestions, I guess, would you have?
Yeah, so I started coaching both managers and neurodivergent employees in the workplace. So now organizations hire me to help coach the neurodivergent employees, which kind of still feels surreal to this day. Um, and so really understanding that a lot of times what I see, and it breaks my heart every time because I'm very close connected to that, is the previous trauma that I was just speaking about, and the previous, even in the school system, they still carry that with them, right? And they're like, feel like they can't advocate for themselves, or someone said something in a tone or in a way that reminded them of past events. And so I'm like, you know what you need to be successful. Really looking at, okay, if you could have any tools or you could have anything to help you succeed, what would that be? What would that start looking like? Oh, maybe I should have an AI note taker because I feel like I want to have the notes from the meeting, but I feel like I'm not engaged in the meeting to the best of my ability when I have to take the notes. So having an AI note taker would be helpful for me, and really getting them to think about, what is the previous things that, you know, they wish they had or what the previous experiences, and also like helping with, coming up with communication tools. So it's like understanding their communication style. And I also, I kind of, I'm like the liaison. They call me, sometimes my clients call me lawyer light because I have the HR and the legislation background. And I know all the laws, but I'm also my Excel is neurodivergent and disabled. And so really being able to mesh those two worlds, but really understanding that, recognizing that there's so many tools out there now. It's 2025. There's so many tools out there. What do you need? And really recognizing that, do you think, do you do better when you have a regular conversation with your manager? Oh, my manager's too much. It's too much on top of me. Like a micromanager. I don't like that. I need more space. Okay, how can you have these conversations with them to let them know that in a clear, direct manner that it's clear to them, and really recognizing that and what that actually looks like in the workplace. And so being able to also recognize that how you best learn, asking these questions, and right. And so I have things to pull from to help these individuals know how to best self advocate for themselves, but really getting to know them as a person and helping them get to know themselves as a
Right.
person is so crucial. And I think I've seen other coaches sometimes they kind of miss that step. They're like, oh, resources and that they know what to implement, but I'm like, I really want to get to know the person, to
Yeah.
know and have them know themselves of how, okay. And so, because a lot of times, again, them from masking or other things and the previous traumas and all these things become less self-assured, which is so sad and so heartbreaking, but
Yeah.
it's sad reality, right? And so again, instead of making them more self-assured, you can ask for that accommodation, you can ask for that support, right? And we also remind them they can ask for these things. And a lot of times they're like, I don't know what I can ask for. Like I have this idea of what maybe I could need, but I don't want to
Yeah.
be shunned or get ostracized by my manager or human resources. I'm like, nope, that's a reasonable accommodation. Even just talking to them about what is a reasonable accommodation and what is not a reasonable accommodation. What does that look
Yeah.
like? Understanding what is undue hardship from the employer perspective, and how it's really hard to do undue hardship. It's quite a lengthy amount, and how
Yeah.
most accommodations and the reasonable accommodations you're asking for doesn't cost anything, or it can end up helping an organization in the long run. And for
Yeah.
example, again, the AI note takers, because those are so prevalent. We had a couple in our call. We
Right.
had that.
Yeah. We had like four of them going. I think two on my part, a couple on your part.
Yes. And so with one of them, because of this client, and so she was like, I told her that she could ask for this note taker. And now even the managers, the human resources, they now use this note taker in the
Yeah.
organization, and it makes them more productive, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like it's going to help the whole organization in the long run, right?
Yeah.
And then I had this time another client that I was doing a training for the managers,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, they're like, oh, we actually have AI note taker we implemented like 2 weeks ago before you did this training because
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
requested it, and it's changed the game, right? And so
Amazing.
that I was brave
Yeah.
enough to self advocate that they needed that, and now it's changed the whole culture of the company, and they have that for all their meetings.
Yeah, and it just kind of highlights like there's a difference between willful ignorance and just simple ignorance. Like you don't know what you don't know, right? And so
Exactly.
you helping them to see that is, I think, really important, and it's so great to see that. Um, my 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 question for you, because we're as we come to the close here, is where do you see the future of accessibility and workplace inclusion heading?
That's a good question. I really see um, the use of technology, such as the AI that I keep mentioning, um, and really, but also looking at the individual approaches. And so being able to use, like, have the technology and the tools at a whole company wide level, but then again, honing in the individual needs, and really recognizing that, again, it's not one size fits all. You can have, the policies and procedures and have these things in place, and creating more, universally designed inclusive workplaces, but also having people managers and managers understand that everyone is different and everyone's unique, and really implementing strategies that work for the individual, and having various toolkits that they can pull from to really help the individuals, and having those toolkits to really recognize that, hey, we have these toolkits, this might work, this might not work, let's try it out. Being open to having more dialogue and being able to really recognize that we're human beings, we're going to make mistakes, there's going to be bumps along the way, but being more committed to really making it a more accessible and inclusive workplace where that changes the culture of the organization by making it more inclusive and accessible.
Yeah. And really like helping, like putting the B in DEIB, like really
Yeah,
helping people to feel like they belong, and not feel
exactly.
othered. I think that's why when I that's why I like DEIB, because I feel like the B is really important, and because you want to feel like you belong wherever you are, because it's a good feeling.
It's like life's too short not to belong and not to feel
Yeah,
like you belong.
hell yeah, amen. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm certain that there are people out there that will want to know how they can work with you and Accessible Creates. So I've included your LinkedIn link for Accessible Creates, and also your LinkedIn and email for reaching you personally. Um, when if people do want to engage you, what is the best way for them to do so? What's your preference? What do you suggest for them?
Wait, you can find me on LinkedIn. Usually, most people, and what I prefer is when people reach out to me directly on my LinkedIn, and
Okay,
then going.
perfect. Okay, well there it is. We've got your LinkedIn profile there. We've got your email, and once again, I'll put up the LinkedIn profile for Accessible Creates, and in the notes, I guess for our recording as well. Once it's up there on in the Ethernet forever, we will it'll be there for them to access. So, Sydney, thanks again so much for your time. It is an utmost pleasure for me for just to be able to engage with you and get your insights and be able to share it with everyone. So thank you much, and thank you very much to the audience as well for the great comments and their I guess contributions to the chat.
Thank you so much for having me, Carlos.
Thanks, Sydney. That was wonderful. Let's talk soon.
Bye all.